Hello everyone, welcome to this latest video. This latest video is titled Russian Forced Concentration During the Initial Invasion Part 1. That's right, this is a two-part series. Cheers to that. Unfortunately, as I was doing the research, as usual, I got way too deep down that rabbit hole, finding more and more data, expanded this presentation, and I realized this is going to be way too long for many of you. And some of you gave me the feedback, please be a bit more concise, so that's what I'm trying to do here. And so this is a two-part series. What are we going to be exploring? Russian forced concentration. We're going to be looking in part 1 on Russian forced concentration during the initial invasion, right? During the full-scale invasion. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is arguably not a success, with an actual successful full-scale invasion of what? Of Iraq, right? When the coalition forces invaded Iraq, they were very successful and they completely managed to conquer Iraq from the beginning. However, you can argue the post phase of the occupation of Iraq was a big fail. Well, here in this situation, we're only going to look and compare the initial invasions of both countries, right? And then I decided to look at the post phase, so what happens after the initial invasion of Ukraine, and here looking at the Russian forced concentration during key battles. What are key battles, key attritional battles? For me, in my definition here, are Bakhmut, Avdiivka, even Kursk with Suza, and there's another couple of key battles. You can see the spoiler down below for part 2, so if you want to watch part 2, that's going to be very interesting. We're basically going to look at, of all the Russian troops, how many are in the front line, and of all those on the front line, how many are involved in these key battles, right? And we're going to see that evolving and changing through time throughout the war. And then I'm going to actually match that with one of my other videos where I'm looking at Russian equipment losses. So sort of high level, see what forced concentration in these key attritional battles, does it have a correlation, even any correlation with the Russian equipment losses through time? Spoiler alert, maybe it does. Right, so let's take a look at this, and I'm going to be enjoying this St. Javelin's cup of coffee. So if you want to support with a donation to Ukraine, for example, for them to buy ambulances or whatever on the front line, peace through superior firepower, right? You can always check out that St. Javelin website. Not sponsored, I bought it myself. So let's jump right in. So jumping right in, we're going to be comparing these two major recent offensives. I know the Iraq invasion is in 2003, so for some of you that sounds like a very long time ago, but it's actually one of the larger recent offensives, recent invasions that occurred, at least in my lifetime. And so I think that that's quite relevant. And here on the map, you see on the left side the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And on the right side, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so we see on the left, I pasted there, failed initial invasion over Ukraine, and then on Iraq, successful initial invasion. And why do I write that it's failed for Ukraine if they've conquered such large chunks of Ukraine? Well, actually, the initial goal and the initial objective of the invasion of Ukraine was to topple the regime and conquer all of Ukraine, if not the vast majority of Ukraine. I mean, I think we all saw those maps that were being posted and discussed by Lukashenko. They wanted to go all the way up to Moldova. They were trying to get into Kiev. So essentially, at least they wanted to get pretty much all of Ukraine or most of Ukraine. And with Iraq, it was actually the same situation. The coalition forces wanted to take over all of Iraq, occupy all of Iraq, and they were successful. But why were they successful? That's something I wanted to analyze. I mean, in both situations, you have a very large superpower. In one case, Russia, right? It's far larger than Ukraine, invading a smaller country, economically, population-wise, etc. And it's the same situation for Iraq, though it might be somewhat more lopsided for Iraq. We're still going to take a look at this because we have the data, and it's in recent memory. It's been a modern invasion. So Ukraine has 41 million people, or had 41 million people in 2022. Iraq had 27 million people. Apparently, by today, Iraq has already more than 40 million people. Insane, but it's true. In 2003, Iraq had 27 million people. Ukraine is 603 square kilometers. Iraq is 437 square kilometers. So Iraq is a bit smaller there. Russia used 190,000 troops during the initial invasion, whereas the coalition forces were at 130,000. So actually, Russia used 60,000 troops more for its initial invasion than the coalition forces did, right? At least looking at the high level numbers, it sort of makes sense, right? Iraq has less people, less territory. And then however, when we look at the next statistic, there was 800,000 Ukrainian soldiers ready to fight at the start of the invasion. That is almost 4 times more than the attacking Russian soldiers. Whereas in Iraq, there was 425,000 Iraqi soldiers. Actually, almost the same proportion, a bit less than 4 times the amount of coalition soldiers, right? So at least there we're still somewhat okay. And the next one is where things get a bit wild, right? When we look at the fronts, Russia invaded from the north, from the east, and from the south. So basically they invaded from everywhere they could, every side they could, with 190,000 troops. You can see on the map, I tried to put red arrows on the main axes that, at least from my feeling, the main axes of the Russian advance. So out of Crimea, we know that there was one axis going straight for Kherson, straight out the gates, and going direction Odessa, presumably. And then one went out of Crimea towards Melitopol and Mariupol to do that encirclement of Mariupol. And then out of Donetsk, we saw 2 axes of advance, one towards Mariupol and one towards the northwest. We know that there was an axis of advance towards Kharkiv. Big fail, that one. We know that there was one bypassing Sumy, one bypassing Chernihiv, both going straight towards Kyiv, and then one that was actually going straight towards Kyiv, right? All those 3 were also big fails. And on the coalition side, actually, it's totally different, right? So I wrote here front south. There's only one front. Yes, based on my research, there was some other activities in the northeast with some special ops, and maybe in the west with some special ops. But out of the 130,000, pretty much all of them were attacking out of Kuwait up north, right? So you can say that 130,000 were all attacking from the same side, whereas the 190,000 Russian troops were attacking from every side, right? Essentially every side except the west. And then front length, over 3,000 kilometers of front length that the Russians were invading over. So basically south, east, and north. And for the coalition forces, the front length was just 254 kilometers. So essentially the Kuwaiti border where they invaded out of. And so in terms of the defender, right, by 2022, the Ukrainian forces were, you could say, battle hardened. They'd been fighting since 2014. I know that as a conscript, you had to rotate in and out of the Donbass front line, right? Because that was actually there was never a real there's been attempted ceasefires, it was never a real ceasefire. So what the Ukrainian military did, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, is every cohort, every year of conscripts, they had to go on the front line where they would get on the field training and then get rotated out at the end of their conscription period, right? So you have a very large cohort. So from 2014 to 2022, that's 8 years, right? You have 8 entire cohorts of conscripts plus the professional military that has combat experience. And then for Iraq, I also wrote that it's a battle-hardened defender. Why? Iraq has been, for example, in the Iran-Iraqi war, which is arguably one of the bloodiest wars of the post-World War II era, so to say, right? Where Iran and Iraq were actually in a very similar war to Ukraine-Russia. You know, it was trench warfare. The front line was barely moving back and forward. So that's why I actually consider the Iraqi army a battle-hardened defender. Not to mention they did invade and conquer Kuwait before getting kicked out by the coalition forces in the first Gulf War. So Saddam Hussein and his forces were definitely not new to war. So in both situations, you have a very large superpower invading this battle-hardened smaller neighbor. If you've been watching so far and you've enjoyed the video, I'm going to make a short break to do a little sponsorship of my own book, AI Revolution, which is a mix of Black Mirror, the show, and World War Z, the book. So if you like World War Z and you like Black Mirror, and you're interested in how AI is going to be changing the world, so essentially this book is a combination of both, and I think you might like it. You can find it on Amazon at a good price, either on Kindle or as a physical copy. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the show. So what I did during the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, on the back of the envelope calculation, was I actually went straight to looking at what are the numbers that the coalition forces used to successfully conquer Iraq, and then compare certain factors with Ukraine to see if Russia had enough troops. And my conclusion back then was they do not have enough troops to successfully conquer all of Ukraine, right? But let's do that now more formally with a slide. And let's take a look at what I did back then, 3 years ago, but in an improved manner, right? Because right now I'm really taking a deeper look at the numbers. And so essentially, assuming that you are the attacker, in this case, you're Russia, and you have one variable, right? The only thing that you can influence is the number of troops that you're using for the invasion of Ukraine. And you know that the coalition forces, when they invaded Iraq, they successfully translated the givens in order for you to have the correct variable, right? So the coalition forces calculate the givens, the defending army size, the size of Iraq, the population of Iraq, the skills of the defending Iraqis, right? And using these things that they could not influence, they came out with the 130,000 required troops. And it was successful. So Russia can use Iraq as a proxy in order to successfully solve for their invasion of Ukraine. Yes, I know that this is probably stupid. It does not solve for geography. It does not solve for the will of the people to defend the country better. It does not solve for many other factors. However, what I think is interesting here is sometimes these dumb approaches, when we do several of these dumb 80-20 approaches, and we take the average of those, that does give us an indication. It might give us a better answer as to what a successful Russian invading force size could have been, right? So here on the left side, we can see I compared Ukraine and Iraq in a table format, right? Using all the data that I presented earlier. And then at the bottom, was the initial invasion successful of Ukraine? No. And of Iraq? Yes. So the 130,000 was successful, 190,000 not successful. And so we're going to use these given variables in order to solve for the variable that Russia can influence, the attacking army size. So when we scale by the defending army size, right? So Ukraine has 800,000 troops. Iraq has 425,000 troops. That means that scaling the 130,000 coalition forces up by a factor of 8.88 gives us 244,000 Russian troops. So based on the defending army size, the 130 coalition forces were able to beat the 425 Iraqi forces. When we scale that, the answer is Russia would need 245,000 troops to successfully defeat Ukraine in the initial invasion. So approximately 60,000 troops more than they did. If we scale it by population, we come to a 1.5 multiplier, so 197,000 troops. Approximately the same amount as the amount they use for the invasion. When we scale by land size, the size of the country, right? Ukraine is a bit larger than Iraq, so there's a factor of 1.38, so they would have needed less troops, 10,000 troops less, 179,000 troops, right? But here, obviously one of you is going to have the comment, artists, you know that Iraq is mostly desert and there's just this thin strip of land where everyone lives, whereas Ukraine is not like that. Yes, I know. This is not the goal of the exercise. The goal of the exercise is simply to use these high-level variables and proxies in order to come to a potential Russian army size, right? When we scale by front length, and front length for me is a proxy for force concentration, right? If you have a very long front, it means that per kilometer of front, you have less troops, right? And so in this case, Russia chose to have an extremely long front. It was almost 12 times longer front than the coalition forces when they went up that from the south to the north up into Iraq. Those 130,000 troops were basically all together moving forward up. Well, the Russian forces were not like that. They were spread out south, east, west into different army groups. And so they had a far lower force concentration. But if we would use the front length of the coalition to successfully take over Iraq, we come to a number of 1.5 million Russian forces, right? So if Russia had wanted the same force concentration along all of its fronts invading, it would have needed 1.5 million forces, yeah? And so that's already a number that is very different from the 190,000 that they actually use, right? And then finally, we have a 3-to-1 attack ratio. This is not one of the numbers from the left side, but it's simply, a general rule. You always want to outnumber the enemy that you're attacking. And so if you know that Ukraine has 800,000 troops defending the country, well, you need at least 2.4 million troops. Again, far, far more troops than what the Russians had. So what can we conclude from this comparison between the Iraqi successful invasion and the Ukrainian unsuccessful initial invasion? Well, here on this next slide, I put up the actuals and then all of the proxy calculated variables for a Russian invading army given the Iraqi numbers, right? So simply looking at these simple ratios and scales and ignoring all other factors such as economics, geography, national will to fight, we come to various very different numbers, right? So when we scale by population, by size of the country, and by defending army, Russia should have approximately 180 to 250,000 troops invading into Ukraine. So actually at 190,000, given those first three proxies, they were not too far off. And actually the population one and the size one almost exactly match the scaling by population ratio. So it's possible, I'm not saying that this is what they did, but it's possible that at one point at least, and I don't know why they wouldn't do it, right? Because this is quite easy and straightforward to do. But it's possible that at one point, when asked how many soldiers do we need to successfully take over all of Ukraine, Putin would ask, the general would sit down and say, well, there's not been that many successful invasions of other countries in past history, but let me take a look at what I can find. And the first thing would be Iraq, as I did. And he would say, well, Ukraine has this much more people and is this size, and the Americans and the coalition forces were successful with only 130,000 troops. And well, we are not that much weaker than the Americans and the coalition forces because we're Russia. We're the second strongest military in the world. So beating Ukraine with similar ratios should be very doable. Mr. Putin, I recommend that we go with approximately 190,000 troops, which is somewhere at the same scale as what the Americans used for the successful invasion of Iraq, right? And then Putin would say, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense. Why would an average Ukrainian be any different than an average Iraqi, right? But I think when we come to the next bullet point here, I think we come to the crux of the matter, which is, however, the entire coalition force, and as I said in the last slide, was attacking from the south to the north, right? They had a force concentration that was far, far larger than the Russian forces. And so to achieve a similar force concentration as the coalition forces invading Iraq, they would have needed 1.5 million men. So here, and I think that's very important because you want to locally outmatch the defender always. And then essentially here they made a massive mistake by, in my opinion, choosing so many different fronts, right? They applied the logic of invading Iraq based on pop size and based on size of the country and based on the defending army size. And then instead of using the same one front attack approach, they decided to basically attack from everywhere, right? And if you attack from everywhere, you attack from nowhere. And that's what happened in the end. Many of the fronts, they had to retreat. And then when we scale from the 3-to-1 ratio, 2.4 million Russian troops would be necessary. And what I would say is likely all of the various ratios are interlinked, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The average of these estimates, right, these 6 numbers that we have here, including the actual number, is at 791,000 troops. And so, right, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Imagine a situation, right, where they had actually a stronger force concentration if they had removed several of the attacking fronts, which would have given them an overmatch, for example, in the Kiev front. Who knows what could have happened? So based on this high-level 80-20 analysis using the Iraqi proxies in order to determine the only variable, the Russian invading size, for a successful conquest, by most counts, the Russian army was too small given its ambition levels, is my conclusion, right, from this. Especially most damning is the front length ratio, sprinkling troops across a huge border. Imagine if the plan to cut the head off the snake by taking Kiev had been successful. Likely many other regions would have fallen in disorganization, right? So by spreading out their forces, they basically won nothing except the south, right? But if they had actually managed to take over Kiev, the whole story might have been completely different. The 190,000 shows a serious underestimation of Ukrainian willingness to fight and perhaps an expectation of a second Crimea, so a Crimea 2.0, which is a very successful takeover in 2014 when the Russian army basically fed a bunch of troops into Sevastopol, where they have a military base and had an agreement, a historic agreement with Ukraine that they would be allowed to maintain their Baltic Sea fleet there. And then essentially what they decided to do during the Maidan revolution is they basically spread that army out across Crimea, the little green men that suddenly appeared out of nowhere, supposedly, and were totally not Russian troops. They spread across the country, dominated the Ukrainian military locally, and did a vote where 100% of the people decided to join Crimea. Right? Totally not corrupt vote. And then, so they were expecting another Crimea. It was not another Crimea. Expect perhaps the only place where it was another Crimea was the successful breakout out of Crimea towards Kherson and Melitopol, which is still something that I believe is insane because that would have been the hardest front. It should have been the hardest front to get out of. Even if you look on Google Maps, you can see that both sides have tons of trenches and stuff prepared since 2014 to 2022. So clearly there was some heavy corruption or something went wrong there, completely wrong. And something went completely wrong when they managed to cross that bridge into the capital city, Kherson, right? And that needs to definitely be investigated. In theory, that whole southern region of Kherson and Zaporizhia should never have been taken over by Russia, right? It should have been impossible to break out of Crimea. And this is actually somewhere where I would say Ukraine really dropped the ball, right? I mean, they had the whole Donetsk front basically not moving for the past 3 years. Yes, it's moved a bit, but it hasn't moved. And in the rest of the country, basically they retreated out. And if they had successfully managed to just keep the Russians in Crimea, which should have been definitely doable. The whole initial invasion would have been a total fail, total disaster, right? They might have taken over Mariupol as the biggest conquest of the whole initial invasion, but it would have been a total disaster, right? And then the final conclusion, alternatively, it shows the inefficiencies in a dictatorship as opposed to a meritocracy/democracy. The Kremlin fell to its own propaganda, right? So in this sense, Putin was confident with the 190,000 troops that he would have a very successful initial invasion. I don't see why he would not have believed that it would be very successful, since he did it, right? And generally, when you make such a massive decision, you probably think that you have all the information you need. You're gonna win for sure, right? With such a big decision, he was confident he would be able to take over everything from Kiev all the way down to Moldova in this Novorossiya, as they call it, and topple the government and maybe place a new Belarus between Poland and the annexed parts of Ukraine, right? So it would have been another Lukashenko placed in what remained of Ukraine. And so he was so confident that the Ukrainians would simply fold, give up, and do nothing, as they did in Crimea in 2014. He threw the dice. He did the Ayayakta Est. He crossed the Rubicon, and now he's stuck in a war that doesn't seem to be ever ending. Join me in part 2, where I will be exploring everything past the initial invasion. We're going to be looking at the key battles, so Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariupol, Kursk, and we're going to be looking at the proportion of troops that are concentrated there, as opposed versus all of the Russian troops. So what proportion of Russian troops out of all troops are actually in these key attritional battles, or involved in these key attritional battles? If you like this initial analysis, and if you want to look at the next analysis, please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see the next videos. I also have several other videos on these topics, such as Russian armored losses through time, the evolution of Russian wages from 2021, so pre-war, to 2025. And I have the Russian casualty estimates video. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.